Three men in black suits froze at the sound of small sneakers on marble. Kang Taemin's hand shot up before his security team could move. One motion. Every man in that hallway went still like their strings had been cut. A 6-year-old girl stood in the middle of the executive floor at 11 at night. Holding a mop bucket handle, she was clearly too small to be pushing, staring up at the most feared man in Seoul like he was a stray dog she'd decided to feed. "Why do you look so sad all the time?" Nobody breathed. Taemin's second, Jinwoo, reached for his earpiece like he needed backup for a question. Taemin lifted 2 fingers. "Stand down. Go back to your mother." His voice was the one that ended business deals and occasionally people. The girl didn't move. "You didn't answer." Behind her, a scream. "Grace!" Jessica Carter came around the corner at a dead run, cleaning cart abandoned somewhere behind her. Terror stripped raw across her face. The specific terror of a black woman far from home, who has just watched her only child walk, unsupervised, into a room full of men who could disappear a person and never lose a night's sleep over it. She grabbed Grace by the shoulders, pulled her back like she was retrieving something from a fire. "I am so sorry," she wandered off. "I turn my back for 1 second, please." Taemin said nothing. Jessica kept talking because his silence was worse than any threat. "It won't happen again. I'll have her sit in the break room. Please don't." She asked me a question. "Sir." She asked why I look sad. He looked at the child instead of the mother. "No one's asked me that in 14 years. Grace tilted her head. "So are you gonna answer?" "No." "Okay." She shrugged like it cost her nothing and reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a fistful of hair bands in every color a 6-year-old could love and held them up like an offering. "Do you want one? They make people less sad. It's science." Jinwoo's jaw actually dropped. Jessica yanked her daughter's wrist down. "Grace, no, I am so sorry, sir. She does this. She thinks everyone needs fixing." Let go of her arm. Jessica let go so fast you'd have thought his voice had physical weight. Taemin crouched. It took every man in that hallway a full 3 seconds to process that their boss, a man whose knuckles were tattooed with a language of violence most of them had personally witnessed him speak, was now at eye level with a first grader holding a fistful of hair elastics. "Not tonight," quieter than anyone had heard him in years, "but don't put those away." He stood, straightened his jacket like the last 90 seconds hadn't happened, walked into his office and shut the door. Jinwoo stared at the door like it might explain itself. Jessica stared at her daughter like she'd just watched her defuse a bomb with a hair tie. "Mommy, why is everyone acting weird?" Jessica didn't answer. She was too busy trying to remember how to breathe. "And honestly, Queens, I need you to sit with me in this hallway for 1 more second before we go any further, because I promise you it does not stay this quiet for long. If this is your first time here, I'm so glad you found your way into this room tonight, because something's about to happen in that building that none of us are ready for, and I don't want you walking in halfway. So tell me, where are you watching from tonight? I read every single one of those. And while you're typing it, go ahead and tap that like button and subscribe too, because this is the kind of story you don't want to stumble onto later out of order, missing the parts that are about to break your heart. Stay close. This is just the doorway." Jessica didn't sleep that night. She lay on the pull-out couch in their 1-bedroom apartment in Itaewon, listening to Grace breathe evenly in the next room like nothing unusual had happened, and ran through every worst-case scenario a mother who cleans offices for a man like that could imagine. Fired. Deported. Worse. She'd taken this job 8 months ago because it paid almost double what the hotel did, and because the night shift meant she could walk Grace to school every morning without paying for care she couldn't afford. She hadn't asked too many questions about who owned the building. You didn't, in this line of work. You cleaned the marble, and you didn't look too hard at what happened in the rooms during the day. Her brother had asked too many questions once, about men exactly like this. It hadn't gone well for him. She pushed that thought down before it could finish forming and got up to check on Grace, who was asleep with 4 hairbands still wrapped around her small wrist like bracelets, like she'd been saving them for something. He didn't fire her. That was the first thing that confused everyone. The second thing was that 3 nights later, when Jessica's cart rattled past his office at 11:40 p.m., the door was open. And Grace, who was supposed to be doing homework in the break room under strict instructions not to move, was sitting cross-legged on the floor of Kang Taemin's office, drawing on the back of what looked like a very important document. Jessica nearly dropped the cart. Grace Elizabeth Carter. He said I could. Grace didn't look up from her drawing. He said the paper was garbage anyway. Taemin was at his desk, reading something on his phone, not even looking at the child sprawled across his floor like she owned it. It was a merger proposal I already rejected. You could have told her no. I did. She didn't listen. That tracks, Jessica muttered before she could stop herself. Something almost moved at the corner of his mouth. Almost. You don't have to let her. I'm aware of what I have to do. It wasn't cold, not exactly, but it closed the conversation like a door. She can stay until you finish this floor, then she goes back to the break room. It wasn't kindness. Jessica told herself that on the walk home. It wasn't kindness, it was a powerful man being bored and indulgent, the way rich men sometimes were with things that amused them. She needed to remember that. She needed to remember what kind of man let his knuckles carry ink like that in the first place. But she also remembered, 3 nights later, finding a box of colored pencils on the break room table that hadn't been there before, still in the plastic, no note, no explanation. She didn't ask. She had a feeling she wouldn't get an answer she could afford to hear. It rained hard the following week, the kind of soul downpour that turns bus stops into rivers, and Jessica's shift ran late enough that the last bus had already gone by the time she and Grace made it to the street. She was doing the math on cab fare against what was left in her account when a car she recognized pulled up at the curb, engine idling, back door already open. Get in, no driver, just him. We're fine, we'll walk to the station. It's a 40-minute walk in this. Get in, Jessica. She stood there a full 10 seconds, rain soaking through her jacket, pride and exhaustion fighting a war she was too tired to win. Grace made the decision for her, climbing into the back seat before Jessica could object further. The drive was quiet except for Grace narrating everything they passed. Jessica sat in the front seat very aware of how small the car felt, how close his hand was on the gearshift to her knee, how he'd angled the heat vents toward her without being asked. You didn't have to do this. Once Grace had gone silent, forehead against the window, half asleep. I know. Then why? Because the idea of you walking 40 minutes in the rain with a 6-year-old bothered me more than it should have. He didn't look at her when he said it. I've been trying to figure out why for a week. Did you figure it out? No, I'm choosing not to look too closely. She didn't have an answer for that. She spent the rest of the ride staring out the window, feeling the heat of his attention on the side of her face, even though he never turned to look at her again, and telling herself, unconvincingly, that her pulse had no business behaving the way it was. It became a pattern nobody named out loud. Grace, on the floor of his office, narrating the plots of cartoons he'd clearly never watched, apparently unbothered that the man listening controlled the fates of half the import routes running through Incheon. Taemin, arms crossed, occasionally correcting her math homework with a precision that suggested he'd once been very good at something ordinary before he became this. Jinwoo watched all of it from the doorway with the barely restrained horror of a man watching his boss diffuse in real time. The Asen family is asking questions about the shipment delay, standing stiffly, while Grace colored an entire quarterly earnings report into what she insisted was a rainbow whale. Sir, this is a security concern. Handle it. Handle the whale. Or the Asen family. Both, without looking up from the small hand, carefully outlining his knuckles in green marker. Hold still. You're the one who moved. I didn't move. You flinched when I got to the scary tattoo one. Jessica, mopping 10 feet away, went very still. It's not scary, like she was correcting a fact, not offering comfort. It's just a tattoo. Tattoos are just drawings people decided to keep forever. She held up his hand and examined her artwork like a surgeon checking her work. "I like my drawing better." He looked at his own knuckles, the real ink permanently there, the marker temporarily layered over it, for longer than the moment should have required. "So do I." Jessica's mop stopped moving entirely. She had to remind her hands what their job was. There was a night, not long after, when Grace fell asleep on the office couch early, worn out from a school trip, and it was just the two of them for almost an hour while Jessica finished the floor. He didn't work. He watched her clean, which should have felt invasive and instead felt like something else entirely. "You watch me the way my brother used to," before she could stop herself. "Like you're waiting for me to trip over something." "I'm not worried about you tripping." "Then what are you worried about?" He was quiet long enough that she turned around. His eyes weren't on her hands, or the mop, or the floor. They were on her mouth, for exactly as long as it took her to notice, and then he looked away like he'd been caught somewhere he had no right to be. "Nothing," finished the floor Jessica. Her name in his mouth still did something to her she refused to examine. She finished the floor. She didn't look at him again that night, because she knew if she did, she wasn't sure what her face would give away, and she wasn't ready to find out what his would give back. The first real crack came on a Tuesday, when Grace arrived with a purple mark blooming under her eye and a story about running into a door that not even a 6-year-old believed while telling it. Jessica's hands shook cleaning that night. Teemin noticed before she said a word. "Who did that?" Not a question, a demand dressed as one. "It's fine, kids at school, it happens." "Who did that?" Something in his voice made Jinwoo, standing in the hallway, quietly step back and start making a phone call before he'd even been told to. Jessica looked at this man whose hands had almost certainly done worse to grown men who'd earned less of his anger than a schoolyard bully, and felt something she couldn't name pull tight in her chest. Not fear. Fear would have been simpler. "You can't just." "I can." That's a child at her school. You can't send whoever you send to." "I'm not going to hurt a 7-year-old, Jessica." Her name in his mouth again, and it landed somewhere she wasn't prepared for a second time. "I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again. There's a difference between violence and protection. You of all people should know that." You of all people, like he knew something about her he shouldn't. She filed that away, the way she'd been filing away small inconsistencies for weeks now. The comment. The way he sometimes looked at her a half-second too long before catching himself. The fact that a man who ran an empire built on fear had somehow made room in his schedule, every single night, for a woman who mopped his floors and a girl who colored on his contracts. She didn't have the full picture yet, but something was assembling itself in the dark, piece by piece, and every instinct she had told her that, when it finished forming, it was going to hurt. 3 days later, the bullying stopped. Nobody explained how. Nobody had to. That same week, Grace showed up with a full set of temporary tattoo sheets from a corner store, cheap, glittery, the kind that peeled off your skin in a bath. Unicorns, rainbows, a single crooked heart. "For your knuckles." She climbed onto the chair across from his desk with the seriousness of a surgeon prepping for an operation. "The marker keeps coming off in one wash. These last longer. I asked the store lady." "You asked a stranger for tattoo advice for a grown man." "I told her it was for my dad." Something flickered across his face, too fast for Grace to catch, not fast enough for Jessica, who was close enough to see it happen. "I'm not your—" "I know." Grace, already peeling the plastic backing off a rainbow sticker with the focus of someone performing surgery. "Hold still." He held still. Jessica stood in the doorway with a vacuum cord in her hand, forgotten, watching a man who could end careers with a phone call sit motionless, while a 6-year-old pressed rainbow decals onto knuckles that had, by every rumor she'd ever half heard in that building, done unspeakable things. "Why do you let her do this?" Quietly, once Grace had fallen asleep on the office couch an hour later. "Really?" Teemin looked at his own hand, inked now in a mismatched row of rainbows and a lopsided unicorn, and didn't answer for a long moment. Because she's the only person in this building who's never once been afraid of me. And I didn't know how much I needed that until she gave it to me. Jessica's chest did something complicated, something dangerous. You should be careful, letting your guard down, in your line of work. I know exactly how dangerous it is. His eyes found hers and held there longer than professional distance allowed. I'm doing it anyway. The air between them changed. Neither of them moved. He was close enough that she could count the individual sticker outlines still faint on his knuckles, close enough to see the exact moment his eyes dropped to her mouth again, longer this time, unhidden this time. T-Min. I know what this looks like. I know what I am. Tell me to stop looking at you like this, and I will. She didn't tell him to stop. She also didn't move closer. She stood in that unbearable middle distance, heart slamming, and reached for the only thing keeping her upright. I have a daughter asleep on your couch. I'm aware. That's not a no. It's not, barely above a whisper. It's a not yet. He nodded once, like that was enough for now, like a man who'd waited 14 years for anything could wait a little longer for this. But something had been said out loud that couldn't be unsaid, and they both knew it. Grace noticed before either adult said a word about it. You guys are being weird again, looking between them with the flat suspicion only a 6-year-old can produce. Weirder than usual. Are you gonna kiss or something? Grace. I'm just asking. Finish your homework. That's not a no either, entirely too pleased with herself, and went back to her math sheet while Jessica silently died of embarrassment and T-Min, for the first time in 14 years, laughed, a real one, short and surprised out of him, like his body had forgotten it still knew how. Jessica had never heard him laugh before. She decided, dangerously, that she wanted to hear it again. The trouble came from Inchin 2 days later, and it came fast. An Asen crew hit one of T-Min's warehouse shipments in broad daylight. Not subtle, not deniable. A message wrapped as a robbery. Jinwoo had the call transferred to T-Min's private line before the dust had settled, voice tight, with the kind of controlled panic that meant things were worse than he was saying. 2 of our men are hurt, not critical. They took the shipment and left a message with it. A pause. They know about the photo. They said, and I'm quoting, that a man who lets a child play with his hands doesn't get to keep what belongs to him. T-Min's face didn't change. That was the frightening part. No fury, no eruption, just a stillness that Jessica, watching from the doorway with her cart, had never seen on him before, not even that first night in the hallway. Get the car. Sir, if you go down there personally, they'll read it as you proving them right, that you have something to prove now. I'm not going to prove anything, Jinwoo. I'm going to end this before it becomes a habit. He was gone 3 hours. Jessica cleaned 2 floors in that time without registering a single thing she'd touched. Phone in her apron pocket, useless, because she had no number to call and no right to expect one. He came back with a split lip he hadn't had before and knuckles, the real ones, under the fatting stickers, freshly bruised. He didn't go to his office. He came to find her on the 4th floor, where she was pretending to clean a window that was already spotless. Nobody else got hurt, before she could ask. That's the only part that matters tonight. What did you do? I made it clear that hitting my shipments would cost more than it earned. I didn't kill anyone, Jessica, if that's what you're asking. I used to solve this with bodies. Tonight I solved it with math. And it worked, and it terrified me a little, how much I wanted to do it the old way instead. Why didn't you? He looked at his knuckles, the ruined stickers, the bruises rising beneath them, and something in his face cracked open, honest in a way she hadn't seen from him yet. Because somewhere in that warehouse, in the middle of it, I thought about a 6-year-old asking me why I looked sad, and I didn't want to give her a reason to ask me that question and mean something worse by it. Jessica set down her rag, crossed the space between them before she'd decided to, reached up, not toward his mouth, not yet, but to the bruised knuckles, careful, deliberate, the way you'd handle something you were afraid of breaking. You should have called me. To do what? Watch. To know you were alive. Her voice cracked on the last word, more than she meant to let it. I don't have anyone to lose right now that isn't Grace. I'd like it very much if you didn't become someone I have to lose too. His forehead dropped to hers. Neither of them closed the last inch. It was almost worse than a kiss, that closeness without the ending, both of them breathing the same unsteady air, both of them choosing, for one more night, not yet. The photo leaked 2 days after that. Someone, a cleaner, a guard, it didn't matter who, had snapped Teemin at his desk, weeks earlier, knuckles decorated in a child's rainbow stickers, and sold it to the one man in Seoul who'd pay real money to see Kang Teemin made small. It hit at the worst possible moment, right on the heels of the warehouse story already spreading through the underworld's whisper network. By morning, it was everywhere in the circles that mattered. The chairman of death wearing a child's stickers, weak enough to bleed for a stranger's warehouse. Soft, compromised, finished. Jinwoo burst into the office without knocking, phone already extended. Sir, this is not contained. Asen is already calling you a liability, they're saying. I know what they're saying. They're going to test you again. Harder this time, because now they think the warehouse cost you something you can't afford twice. If you don't answer this the way they expect. I heard you, Jinwoo. Jessica stood frozen by the door with her cart, understanding for the first time the actual size of what she'd let her daughter walk into. This wasn't a rich man's harmless indulgence. This was a war, and Grace's rainbow stickers had just become a weapon aimed at the man wearing them. You need to distance yourself from them, quieter now, almost pleading. Both of them, today, before someone decides the cleaner and her daughter are the easiest way to hurt you. Jessica's blood went cold. Teemin's jaw tightened. No one touches them. With respect, sir, that decision is not entirely yours to make anymore. You made them a target the moment you let that photo exist, and the warehouse only made them a bigger one. The room went silent. Jessica realized, distantly, that her hands were shaking on the cart handle. Get out, not to Jessica, to Jinwoo. Jinwoo left, the door shut. You should go, quietly, not looking at her. Tonight, don't come back tomorrow. I'll make sure you're paid through the month. I'll find you something else, somewhere they can't reach, but you cannot be here anymore, and neither can she. You're firing me. I'm protecting you. Those aren't the same thing, and you don't get to decide which one this is. Her voice cracked in a way she hated. You don't get to almost kiss me one night and hand me severance the next, alone, in one conversation, and call both of them love. I'm trying to keep your daughter alive, Jessica. And I'm trying to understand why a man like you cares whether she is. The words came out before she could stop them, sharper than she meant, weeks of unasked questions finally cracking open. Because men in your line of work don't do this. They don't let little girls draw on merger documents. They don't drive through the rain to pick up a cleaner. They don't come back from a warehouse fight looking for permission to feel something. So either you're lying to me about who you are, or you're lying to yourself about why you're doing this. And I need to know which one, before I let you decide anything else for my daughter's life. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the command it usually carried. 14 years ago, there was a shipment. A man on the docks who wasn't part of our organization, who wasn't supposed to be there, who got caught between two rival crews during a handoff that went wrong. I wasn't the one who gave the order. I was 26 years old, and I was the one who tried to stop it, and I was 30 seconds too slow. Jessica's whole body had gone still. His name was Marcus. The mop clattered out of Jessica's hands. My brother's name was Marcus. I know. You knew. Her voice broke entirely now. This whole time you knew who I was, and you let my daughter. I found out 3 months after I hired you. Not before. I didn't do this on purpose, Jessica. I swear to you, I didn't seek you out. But you kept it from me. Because I didn't know how to tell you the man who couldn't save your brother was the same man signing your paycheck. His voice broke on the last word. I have spent 14 years trying to be someone who could have stopped that night. Every decision I've made since, every ounce of control I built, was so it would never happen again on my watch. And then your daughter walked into my office and asked why I looked sad. And I realized I'd built an empire out of guilt and called it strength. And I didn't know how to say any of that to you without losing the only thing that's made me feel human in 14 years. Jessica stood there, grief and fury and something achingly tender colliding in her chest all at once, unable to separate any of it from the others. Get out. Quiet, not a scream, worse than a scream. I need you to leave this room right now. He left without another word. And Queens, I need you to sit with me here for just a second, because I don't think either of us saw that coming the way it just landed. She just found out the man she's been falling for, the one whose forehead was against hers 2 nights ago, is tied to the single worst night of her life, and he let her walk into that office for months without telling her. I am genuinely torn on this one, so tell me where you land. If you think he owed her that truth the moment he found out, hit that like button right now and stand with Jessica in this. And while your thumb's already there, go ahead and subscribe too if you haven't, because this story is not done with either of them yet. But if part of you thinks he was protecting her the only way he knew how, even if it was the wrong way, I want that in the comments just as loud. Does loving someone give you the right to decide what pain they're allowed to carry? I genuinely need to know where you land, because this story is about to ask that question again, and I don't think there's an easy answer. She didn't go back the next night. Jinwoo called twice. She didn't answer. On the 3rd night, there was an envelope pushed under her apartment door, no note, just enough money to cover 2 months' rent and a folded piece of paper with an address for a school in a different district, a good one, already paid through the year. She almost threw it away. She kept it instead because she was a mother before she was anything else, and pride didn't put food on the table. Grace asked about him every night that first week, and every night the questions got harder to deflect. Is he sad again? Somebody has to remind him about the stickers. Grace, it's complicated. You always say that when you don't want to tell me the truth. By day 5, Grace had stopped asking and started noticing instead. The way her mother didn't sleep, the way she stood at the window some nights like she was waiting for a car that wasn't coming. On day 6, she climbed into Jessica's bed uninvited, small and serious in the dark. Did he do something bad? No, baby. Did you do something bad? No. Then, why are we sad about him instead of just being sad at him? Those are different things, and you taught me that. Jessica didn't have an answer for that one. She held her daughter until Grace fell asleep and lay awake a long time turning the question over, because a 6-year-old had just named something she hadn't been able to name for herself in 6 days, that this wasn't anger anymore. It was grief for something that had barely gotten the chance to become what it was going to be. On the 8th night, Jinwoo showed up at her building, alone, no security detail, looking like a man who hadn't slept. Asen moved again, no preamble. Harder this time, they tried to take the Inshan route by force. The way I warned him they would. He handled it, personally. Not the way he would have a year ago, not with the men, not with fear. He handled it clean and quiet, and it cost him almost everything he had left because he wouldn't let it touch anyone outside that room. He hasn't slept. He hasn't eaten. He sits in that office every night with your daughter's stickers still on his hand because he refuses to wash them off, even now, even with half the underworld calling it his weakness. Why are you telling me this? Because I've worked for that man for 9 years, and I have never once seen him choose to be something other than feared. Until you and your daughter walked into that hallway. I don't know what happens between you and him. That's not my business. But I know what happens to him if this is where it ends, and I don't think you want that on your conscience any more than he wants your brother on his. He left before she could respond. Jessica sat on the edge of her bed for a long time that night, holding the folded address of the school he'd paid for, thinking about the difference between a man who causes damage and a man who spends 14 years trying to atone for damage he didn't cause fast enough to stop. She thought about forgiveness. She thought about whether it was hers to give, and whether Marcus would have wanted her to give it, and she didn't have an answer, not a clean one, not that night. But she thought about the way T-Min's voice had broken saying her brother's name. She thought about a forehead against hers, and a not yet that had never gotten its yes. Grief didn't lie the way people did. She'd cleaned up enough performances in that building to know the difference. The boardroom the next morning had gone dead silent before Teemin even sat down. Every man at that table had seen the leaked photo. Every man at that table had heard about the warehouse. Every man at that table had spent a week deciding whether the chairman of death had finally gone soft enough to challenge for good. Kang Teemin walked in, sat down, laid both hands flat on the table in full view of every rival, ally, and informant in the room. The rainbow stickers were still there, faded, peeling at the edges, left on deliberately in front of the exact men who'd used them as a weapon. Nobody said a word. "You've all seen the photo," finally, into the silence. "Some of you sent it, some of you laughed. All of you drew the same conclusion that a man who lets a child draw on his hands must have lost the will to be feared. Some of you tested that conclusion at my warehouse 2 weeks ago. You already know how that ended." He let that sit. "You were wrong about what it meant. You were not wrong that something changed. I am done pretending the only way to hold power in this room is to have none of it touch me. I buried who I was for 14 years because I thought guilt and control were the same thing. They're not. And I would rather be the man wearing these." He lifted his hand. "Let every man see it clearly, then go back to being the man who needed you to believe I felt nothing at all." Nobody at that table moved for a long moment. Then, one by one, the men who had come ready to challenge him folded their hands and said nothing, because they understood, the way men like that always eventually understand, that they had just watched someone become more dangerous, not less. A man with nothing left to lose was predictable. A man who had finally found something worth protecting was not. He found her outside Grace's new school that afternoon, standing at a distance that respected exactly how much damage he'd caused, hands in his pockets, rainbow stickers still faintly visible on his knuckles even now. "I'm not here to ask you to come back," before she could speak. "I'm here because I owed your brother 14 years of an apology I was too much of a coward to make to the people who actually deserved to hear it. I'm making it now. To you. However you need to hear it, angry, cold, however long it takes. I'll say it as many times as you need." Jessica stood there, arms crossed, guarding a heart that had already been cracked open twice by this man, and knew exactly how much it would cost to let him do it a third time. "I'm not asking you to forgive what happened to Marcus. I don't think that's mine to ask for. I'm asking you to let me be the man your daughter believed I could be, even after she knew exactly how sad I was. She saw something in me before either of us understood why. I'd like the chance to prove her right. And I'd like the chance to earn the yes I never got that night in your office, whenever you're ready to give it. I'm not going anywhere while I wait." Grace came running out of the school gates at that exact moment, spotted him across the yard, and broke into a full sprint. "You still have them on." "I told you I would." She skidded to a stop in front of him and inspected his knuckles like an expert reviewing prior work. "They're fatting. I have more at home." "I know. Are you gonna be sad again?" He looked past her, at Jessica, standing there with her arms still crossed but her guard, for the first time in 8 days, visibly cracking. "That depends," quietly, "on your mom." Jessica closed her eyes, opened them, looked at this man who had built an empire out of grief and was now standing in a school parking lot, hands covered in a child's stickers, asking for something he had no right to expect and every reason to hope for anyway. "One conversation. That's all I'm promising tonight. One conversation, and you tell me everything, all of it. No more pieces I have to find out on my own. All of it, starting with the truth I should have told you the day I found out your name." She reached out slowly and took his hand, the one still faintly rainbow, still healing underneath, and held it like she meant it. And for the first time in 8 days, that felt like enough to build something on, and Queens, look at where we ended up tonight. A man who spent 14 years punishing himself for a night he didn't choose. A woman who has every right to walk away and hasn't. A little girl who saw the truth in him before either adult was brave enough to say it out loud. I don't know if she forgives him. I don't know if she should, and I don't think this story does either. If you're new here, welcome, I mean that. Whoever you are, wherever you found this tonight, I'm glad you're here for this one. Tell me where you're watching from. I want to know who sat with me for this. And if this found you the way it needed to, go ahead and like it, subscribe, and stay close, because there is so much more coming for Teemin and Jessica, and you do not want to miss where this goes next. Before you go, I need you to think about someone in your life who's carrying guilt that isn't fully theirs to carry, and send them this one. Not because it'll fix anything, just because sometimes the people we love need to hear that it's possible to be forgiven for the 30 seconds you couldn't control, even when it feels like it should have been enough to save everything. Tell me in the comments, would you have given him that one conversation, or was 8 days of silence already more grace than he'd earned? I'll see you queens in the next one.